The elevator doors slid open with a low chime, spilling a strip of golden light into the marble corridor of the Lexington Grand. It was past midnight when Julian Woolf finally returned from a charity gala that had dragged too long, his tuxedo jacket slung over his arm, his mind already halfway into the quiet solitude of his penthouse. He pressed the keycard. The lock clicked, and then everything that was predictable about his world, numbers, control, precision, ceased to make sense. There, in the middle of his king-sized bed, a young woman lay fast asleep, bare shoulders against white sheets, brown hair scattered like spilled ink across the pillow, the soft rhythm of her breathing the only sound in the room. For a man who built empires, Julian froze. His instinct was to call security, but he didn't. He simply stood at the doorway, one hand still gripping the doorknob, staring as if she were an apparition. The city's neon light filtered through the glass wall, tracing her silhouette in silver. There was no fear in her, just exhaustion, the kind born from heartbreak. Her face was peaceful, untouched by the chaos that ruled his life. He took a slow breath. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was loneliness. But Julian placed his jacket aside, loosened his tie, and walked quietly to the other side of the bed. He hesitated. Then, with the carefulness of a man disarming a bomb, he lay down next to her, not touching, not speaking, only listening to the faint sound of her breathing echo in the dark. For the first time in 5 years, the bed that had been empty since the night his fiancée died didn't feel like a grave. When morning came, sunlight spilled through the curtains. Landing on her face first, Layla Quinn stirred, frowning against the brightness. The sheets shifted. She turned and froze. A man was lying beside her. Not just any man, the man. Julian Woolf, New York's most enigmatic billionaire, the face on every finance magazine, the man whose name was whispered in boardrooms like a spell. Her heart nearly stopped. What are you? Oh, my God, she stammered, clutching the blanket to her chest, eyes wide. Julian opened his eyes slowly, like someone who had expected the storm. His voice was deep, low, annoyingly calm. "You're not exactly the kind of surprise I expected this morning." Layla's throat went dry. I can't explain. This wasn't supposed to. Oh my God, I'm going to jail. He sat up, elbows resting on his knees, studying her with unnerving composure. "You're not going to jail," he said, "but you're going to tell me why you broke into my penthouse." Her cheeks burned crimson. She was still wrapped in his blanket, hair tangled, mascara smudged. "It was a dare," she muttered, barely audible. Julian blinked once. "A dare? Yes, my friends. They thought it would be funny if I—" She swallowed hard. "I just had to lie here for an hour. Then I'd leave. But I must have fallen asleep." He tilted his head, lips curving in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You broke into a billionaire's bedroom for a dare?" Layla nodded, mortified. "I swear I didn't mean—" Julian raised a hand. "Stop apologizing. You look terrified enough already." Silence hung between them, absurd and fragile. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the sheet, trying to remember how to breathe. Julian reached for his shirt from the chair, buttoning it slowly, eyes never leaving her. "You can relax. I'm not calling security. Just get dressed." Relief flooded her chest, quickly followed by a wave of humiliation. She gathered her clothes from the floor, her dress, her shoes, and hurried to the bathroom. Julian stood by the window, watching the city wake below, his reflection faint in the glass. Something about her had unsettled him, the innocence maybe, or the way she'd looked at him, half afraid, half ashamed, like someone who didn't belong anywhere. When she stepped out, fully dressed, she mumbled, "I'll go." "I'm so sorry." He turned then, eyes calm but unreadable. "Wait!" Layla froze at the door. Julian walked closer, every movement deliberate, his tone strangely soft. "Come back tomorrow. 10 a.m., she blinked.
Why?
"Because I'd like to know why a girl like you thought she needed to do something that reckless." Layla's mouth opened, but no words came out.
He was serious, and she couldn't decide which was crazier, breaking into his room or being invited back. Are you serious? Always, he said simply. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Layla pressed her back against the mirrored wall, heart still racing.
The night flashed through her mind, the bar, the laughter, the humiliation that pushed her into saying yes to the dare. It had started as a joke.
Come on, Layla, you've been boring since forever. Live a little.
Her friend Naomi had shouted over the music. The challenge was stupid. Sneak into a penthouse room that Naomi's boyfriend, a hotel employee, could unlock, stay there an hour,
And leave proof. Layla had said yes, only because she wanted to feel something after catching her boyfriend with someone else that night.
anything other than the numb ache in her chest. She never thought she'd fall asleep, never thought someone would actually come back, and certainly not him. That morning, as Julian stood alone in the penthouse, the faint warmth where she had lain still lingered on the sheets. He looked down, almost smiling to himself.
A dare, he murmured.
Of all the ways for the universe to test me. But as he turned away, something in his chest shifted. Small, unfamiliar, dangerous. He didn't know her name yet, but he already knew one thing: he wanted to see her again. Layla hesitated at the revolving doors of Wolf Tower, staring up at the glass skyscraper that sliced into the Manhattan sky. The sun hit the surface, throwing shards of light that made her squint. Or maybe that was just her brain trying to convince her to turn around. This is insane, she thought. She was here because a billionaire who found her half naked in his bed had told her to come back. And worse, she had said yes. Her reflection in the glass looked small, nervous, painfully out of place. Jeans, a cream sweater, hair pulled into a clumsy bun. She looked nothing like the women who worked inside, confident, sculpted, perfectly put together. But still, she pushed the door open. The receptionist didn't even blink when Layla said, "Julian Wolf asked me to come." She was escorted to the private elevator and taken straight to the 72nd floor. When the doors slid open, the air felt different. Colder, quieter. A symphony of polished steel, soft jazz, and city light. The penthouse office looked more like a gallery than a workplace. Minimalist furniture, massive windows, a single black piano in the corner. And there he was, Julian Wolf, in a charcoal suit, sleeves rolled up, a glass of espresso in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. When he looked up, his eyes were unreadable, cool grey, like the Atlantic in winter. "You came," he said simply, as if he hadn't left her completely bewildered last night. Layla swallowed hard. "You told me to." A faint, almost invisible smile tugged at his lips. "And you do everything strangers tell you?" "Only the rich ones," she blurted, before realizing what she'd said. He actually laughed, a low, surprised sound, like someone who'd forgotten how. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to ease the tension hanging in the air. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, Miss Quinn." She obeyed, fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "How do you know my name?" He tapped his tablet. "You left your wallet in my room. I had someone return it to you this morning." Her face flushed. "Oh." Julian studied her for a moment, the silence stretching. "So, tell me, Layla Quinn, why did a design student with no criminal eyes recall break into a penthouse worth $20 million? She stared at her hands. "It was a stupid dare. I didn't think anyone would actually." "Come home?" he finished. Yes, I gathered that. She dared a glance at him. He wasn't mocking her, not exactly. There was curiosity there, and something softer, though fleeting. The kind of softness that didn't belong to a man who controlled half of New York's investment capital. Julian leaned back, fingers steepled. You could have picked any room in the building. Why mine? Layla hesitated. The truth felt too embarrassing to say out loud, but he waited, and there was something about his gaze that made lying impossible.
I didn't choose, she admitted. It was random. My friends were drunk. I just wanted to feel something that wasn't heartbreak for once. He didn't look away. Who broke your heart? My boyfriend, she said quietly. 3 years together.
I found him with someone else last night. Julian's expression didn't change, but his voice softened. I see, Layla gave a small, shaky laugh. So yeah, I guess breaking into a billionaire's room felt poetic. The world's worst rebound decision. Julian's eyes flickered with something unreadable, amusement maybe, or empathy. Well, he said, you've set a high bar for bad decisions. I tend to excel at those, she muttered. For a while they just sat there, the hum of the city below, the faint hiss of the espresso machine filling the silence. Layla felt oddly calm. The fear that had paralyzed her the night before was fading, replaced by a fragile curiosity about this man who seemed both untouchable and inexplicably human. Finally, Julian said, What do you study? Interior design. Senior year at Parsons. He nodded slowly. So you make spaces feel alive? She blinked at the phrasing. I guess so. He looked around the room. Cold, perfect, expensive. Maybe that's why you ended up here, he murmured. This place could use a heartbeat. Layla tilted her head. You mean this office? He gave a small shrug. This life? The honesty of it caught her off guard. For a second she saw not the billionaire investor, but a man who hadn't let anyone close in years. Why did you invite me back? She asked quietly. You could have just had me arrested. Julian met her eyes. Because you didn't steal anything. That's not a reason. He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his tone was almost gentle. Because you're the first person who's ever been in that bed since she died. Layla froze. She? He nodded once. My fiancée, 5 years ago. Silence filled the space again, heavier this time, but not suffocating. She didn't know what to say. No words felt right. So she whispered, I'm sorry. He smiled faintly. Everyone says that. But you didn't know her. No, Layla said softly. But I know what it's like to lose something that felt like everything. Julian studied her again, the faintest trace of warmth in his gaze. Then maybe you should come back tomorrow. Tomorrow? She repeated, blinking. Why? Coffee, 10 a.m. No dares this time. She wanted to laugh, but couldn't. You're serious again? Always. Layla stood up, heart fluttering with something she didn't dare name.
You're strange, she said. Julian's lips curved. So they tell me. When she stepped out of Wolf Tower, the morning sun hit her face. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel quite as heavy. She still didn't understand why he'd asked her to come back.
Maybe curiosity, maybe loneliness. But as she walked down Lexington Avenue, a quiet thought crossed her mind. Maybe two broken people had just accidentally found the same piece of light. When Layla returned the next morning, the lobby of Wolf Tower was quieter, bathed in the soft gold of early sunlight. The receptionist recognized her this time and simply nodded before calling the private elevator. As she ascended, Layla's reflection trembled in the mirrored walls, her fingers clutching a small paper bag from a nearby cafe. Inside was a croissant because somehow bringing food felt less like walking into a billionaire's office uninvited. When the doors opened, Julian was already there, sitting by the panoramic window, sleeves rolled up, the skyline sprawling endlessly behind him. "You're punctual," he said, without looking up. "You said 10, she replied.
I didn't want to be late for whatever this is. He glanced at the bag in her hand.
"Bribery? Peace offering," she countered, "in case you were planning to sue me." A quiet smile ghosted across his lips. "I'm not suing you. I'm curious." Layla placed the bag on the coffee table and took a seat opposite him. For a few seconds neither spoke, just the hum of the espresso machine and the soft city noise far below. Julian finally broke the silence. "Do your friends often dare you to trespass on strangers?" She laughed, embarrassed. "No, that was a first."
I think they wanted to cheer me up after the breakup. He leaned back, watching her with those unreadable grey eyes.
"Did it work?" Layla paused.
Oddly, yes.
"Not at first, but—" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I guess waking up next to a stranger made me realize how little my ex ever made me feel alive." Julian looked amused. "That's a strange metric for recovery." "Maybe, but you seemed oddly calm for a man who found a stranger in his bed." He sipped his espresso before answering. "I don't usually panic over things I don't understand."
I prefer to study them. So I'm an experiment? An anomaly, he corrected.
"People break into penthouses to steal art, not to sleep." Layla laughed softly. "And maybe I'm just bad at crime." Julian's gaze softened. "You're not bad at honesty, though." "That's rare." That line silenced her. There was something in the way he said it, a tone that carried both admiration and loneliness. She tilted her head. "You don't get much honesty, do you?" He hesitated, eyes drifting toward the skyline. "People tend to say what they think I want to hear." "And what do you want to hear?" Julian met her eyes, expression unreadable. "Something real." The words hung between them like a fragile thread. After a long moment, Layla opened the paper bag and slid the croissant across the table. "Then start with breakfast." "It's as real as it gets," he almost smiled, almost. Then, unexpectedly, he took it, tore it in half, and handed her a piece. "You're aware this cost me 10 years of reputation." "Sharing carbs?" "Sharing breakfast with an intruder." They both laughed. Quiet, genuine laughter that filled the sterile office with something warmer. For a moment, Layla forgot who he was, forgot the articles that called him the Wolf of Wall Street reborn, forgot the tailored suits and impossible wealth. Sitting across from her, he looked like any other man trying to remember how to live. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Tell me about your work." "Why design?" Layla hesitated. "Because it's the only way I can create control out of chaos."
My life was messy growing up.
"Designing spaces made me feel like I could fix something, even temporarily." He nodded slowly. "So you fix rooms?"
I fix markets.
"We're both control addicts," she chuckled. "Except your addiction pays better." Julian gave a dry laugh, but there was something haunted in his eyes. "It also costs more." He stood and walked toward the window. "You ever notice how high up everything feels peaceful until you remember how far you could fall?" Layla joined him, standing beside the glass. From here, Manhattan looked small, almost toy-like. The city's noise couldn't reach this high. "Maybe peace isn't the absence of noise," she said softly. "Maybe it's learning not to fear it." Julian turned to her, and for the first time, he really looked at her. Not the nervous girl from last night, but someone who had known pain and somehow kept her softness intact. "You're different," he murmured. "So are you," she said. "You just hide it better." He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Maybe I'm tired of hiding." The clock ticked past 11. The city gleamed below them, cold and bright. Julian finally said, "I'm not sure what this is, Layla, but if you're willing, I'd like you to keep coming back." She blinked.
Every morning? He nodded.
10 a.m., no rules, just coffee. Layla studied him, her heart tugging between fear and curiosity. He looked so certain, so composed, and yet behind that certainty was something raw. "Why me?" she asked.
You could talk to anyone. A therapist, a friend, he interrupted quietly. Because you don't want anything from me. Her chest tightened. And what if I start to?
He met her gaze. "Then we'll both be in trouble." They stood there, sunlight spilling through the glass, two people suspended somewhere between distance and understanding. Layla finally nodded.
Okay, Julian Wolfe, 10 a.m. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her.
"Layla?" She looked back. He smiled, faint but real. "Next time, bring 2 croissants." The next morning came with a drizzle that silvered the city. New York looked softer under the rain, its chaos muted, its edges blurred. Layla stood in front of the mirrored elevator doors of Wolfe Tower again, holding 2 croissants this time. She had barely slept. The elevator chimed open at the top floor, and Julian was there, already brewing coffee like it was a ritual. His shirt sleeves were rolled halfway up, the faint scent of cedar and espresso mixing in the air. "You came back," he said, without looking at her. "You told me to," she answered, placing the bag on the counter.
And you asked for 2 croissants. He glanced up, amused.
"You follow instructions well. I'm a designer."
I thrive on structure, she said, then smirked. And caffeine. Julian handed her a cup.
"Then you're in the right place." They sat at the edge of the panoramic window again, the world sprawling beneath their feet. The morning silence between them wasn't awkward anymore.
It was almost
peaceful. "So," she began, tracing the rim of her cup, "do you invite all random trespassers for coffee, or am I just special?" Julian chuckled softly, a quiet, unfamiliar sound that made her heart skip. "Let's just say you're my first experiment in chaos," Layla arched a brow. "And how's that going?" He tilted his head, pretending to consider. "You haven't stolen anything yet." "Promising start," they both laughed, a small, real moment that felt like sunlight sneaking into a room long kept dark. As their mornings became a pattern, conversations deepened. Layla learned that Julian had grown up in Connecticut, in a family where affection was rationed like currency. His father had built Wolfe Capital from scratch and expected Julian to be sharper,
faster, colder. She listened without judgment.
and he, surprisingly, kept talking. One morning he said, "I stopped sleeping in that penthouse 5 years ago." Layla looked up from her coffee. "Why?" Julian's gaze drifted toward the skyline, voice low. "Because that was where I was supposed to start my life with someone." There was a long pause before he continued.
Her name was Elise, my fiancée.
"She died in a car crash on her way to meet me." Layla didn't speak. She simply reached for her cup, as though the warmth might soften the ache in her chest. "I thought I'd sold my soul to build something invincible," he said quietly. "But when she died, everything stopped meaning anything." The rain tapped softly on the glass, a steady rhythm against the silence. "I'm sorry," Layla whispered. Julian shook his head slightly.
Don't be. I don't need pity. I just forgot what it's like to talk about her without breaking. Layla looked at him, really looked, and saw not the billionaire on magazine covers,
but a man quietly trying to forgive himself. "Then maybe," she said gently, "you just needed someone to listen." Julian turned his head, meeting her eyes. "And you?"
Why were you really there that night? Layla froze.
For a moment she wanted to hide behind humor again, but his gaze was too steady, too kind. "I think," she said slowly, "I was tired of being the background character in my own life. My ex, he made me feel small, invisible. That night I just wanted to do something stupid enough to feel."
Real again. He nodded as though he understood perfectly.
"You're not invisible, Layla Quinn. You just haven't been seen by the right people." The words hit harder than she expected. Something inside her, something small and neglected, began to stir. The next few mornings turned into a rhythm neither of them questioned. Coffee, Croissants, stories, silence that felt like safety. Julian began to laugh more. Small, awkward laughs at first, then full ones that startled him. One morning, when she tripped over the corner of his Persian rug and almost spilled coffee on his suit, he laughed so hard he had to set his cup down. "You're impossible," he said, shaking his head. "And yet you keep inviting me back," she teased, smiling. His laughter faded into a softer expression, something close to tenderness.
"You make this place feel less sterile." She looked around the office, all glass, chrome, and perfection, and said,
"Maybe it just needed a little imperfection." Julian stared at her a moment longer than necessary, his lips parting slightly as though he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he turned back to the window. "Do you ever wonder," he said quietly, "why two people cross paths the way we did?" Layla smiled faintly. "Maybe because you needed a dare, and I needed a reason." He turned to her, eyes glinting.
"And what are we now? A reason or a dare?"
She thought for a moment before answering. Maybe both. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the city like gold dust. For a fleeting moment, it illuminated Julian's face. And Layla could swear she saw something change there, something soft and vulnerable flickering behind his composure. Neither of them spoke again. They just sat there. Two strangers, two mirrors, quietly finding pieces of themselves in the other. And for the first time in 5 years, Julian Wolfe smiled, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The invitation arrived in an envelope black as ink, embossed with silver letters, the St. James Foundation Annual Charity Gala. Layla turned it over in her hands, reading the small card inside. Dress code, formal. Bring your smile. Julian had left it on her coffee cup that morning, as if it were nothing. "Come with me," he'd said, casual, like asking her to grab lunch. Now, standing in front of the mirror in her tiny apartment, she was anything but casual. She had borrowed a dark navy dress from her roommate. Simple, fitted, and just elegant enough to pass. She barely recognized herself. When she arrived at the venue, the marble staircase gleamed under the chandeliers, the air humming with champagne and money. Cameras flashed. Women in silk gowns and diamonds glanced over,
measuring her in one sweep. And then she saw him. Julian Wolfe stood at the center of the crowd like gravity itself. Sleek, black suit,
cufflinks catching the light, expression unreadable. But when his eyes found her, something in them softened instantly. He walked toward her, ignoring the murmurs. "You came," he said, his voice low, carrying that steady calm that always disarmed her. "You invited me," she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "You look." He hesitated, then smiled faintly.
"Unexpected," she laughed, the tension easing. "I'll take that as a compliment." He offered his arm, and as she slipped her hand through it, whispers rippled through the crowd. "Who is she? Is that the girl from the design school?"
"He never brings anyone." Layla tried to ignore them, but she felt their eyes like a weight. Julian leaned close, murmuring, "They'll stare until someone else arrives richer or louder. Breathe." His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was warmth there. A protective undertone. "I'm fine," she whispered back. "I know," he said. "But I'm here anyway." The gala unfolded in a blur of speeches, laughter, and clinking glasses. Layla stood beside him through introductions to senators, CEOs, socialites, all smiling too wide, their compliments edged with curiosity. At one point, a woman with diamonds like icicles leaned in, voice dripping sugar. "And who might this lovely young thing be?" "Julian, you've been hiding her well." Layla felt her throat tighten, but Julian didn't flinch. "This is Layla Quinn," he said evenly.
"She's not hidden. I just hadn't found a reason to bring anyone, until now." The woman blinked, momentarily disarmed.
Layla's chest warmed. For once, someone had claimed her. not as property, but as presence. Later, as they stood near the balcony, she finally let out a breath.
"You're good at that," she said. "At what?"
"Making sharks back off," he smiled. "I've had practice." The orchestra swelled inside the ballroom. Couples began to drift toward the dance floor, bathed in amber light. Julian turned to her, extending his hand. "Dance with me?" Layla froze.
"I can't. I don't. Neither do I," he interrupted, a hint of playfulness softening his features. She stared at his outstretched hand, heart thudding.
Finally, she placed hers in his. He led her gently, his touch light but steady. They swayed, not perfectly, not gracefully, but it didn't matter. The noise around them faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of their steps, the rise and fall of breath. "Everyone's watching," she murmured. Julian's eyes held hers. "Let them."
"I'm done pretending I don't live." Something inside her cracked open at that. A quiet understanding that this man,
so composed, so untouchable, had been waiting for something to shake him awake. When the song ended, he didn't let go immediately. His fingers lingered against hers before he finally stepped back. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For making me remember what it feels like to exist outside numbers and deals." Layla smiled faintly. "You make that sound like I did something profound." "You did," he replied, eyes dark and steady. "You showed up." Later that night, they stood alone on the balcony overlooking the glittering skyline. The wind carried the scent of roses and rain. Layla leaned on the railing, her hair brushing his shoulder. "This world," she said quietly. "It's beautiful and exhausting." Julian nodded.
"It's not real. Not most of it." She turned to him. "And what's real for you?"
His gaze met hers, unguarded for the first time.
"You standing here looking at me like I'm not a headline." Her heart twisted.
"You're not," she said.
"I see you." The silence stretched between them, not empty, but full. Julian reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek.
"You shouldn't." "Too late," she whispered. He smiled, a slow, sad smile. "Then maybe I should start seeing you too." They stood like that for a while, city lights flickering below them. Somewhere inside, Layla knew this wasn't just a story about chance or curiosity anymore. This was a collision, quiet, slow, and inevitable. As they left the gala, paparazzi lights flared at the entrance. Julian instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her from the flashes. His hand found hers again. "Breathe," he said, under his breath. She squeezed his hand back. "I am." Inside the car, as the city drifted past in streaks of golden shadow, Julian glanced at her reflection in the window and murmured almost to himself,
"I don't know what this is, but I don't want it to end." Layla didn't answer.
She didn't need to. Her hand stayed in his all the way home. The morning light filtered through the blinds in a pale, deliberate way, throwing neat bars of brightness across the office floor. It was quiet in a way Layla had started to learn meant more than absence of sound. It meant that the city was holding its breath, as if waiting to see what would come next. Julian sat at the edge of the leather sofa, hands folded around a steaming cup of coffee. His suits hung on the chair like armor he no longer needed to wear, and for a moment, only a moment, he looked unarmored. Not the headline-making titan, but a man who had learned how to carry grief like a second skin. "You ever think about the people you used to be without noticing how much they changed you?" he asked, not looking at her. Layla stared at him, trying to place the tremor in his voice. "All the time," she said. "Mostly when I look at things I used to love and see I don't anymore." He gave a small, almost bitter smile. She loved everything. Rain-soaked street corners in Rome, old records, the way sunlight hits a cracked plaster wall and makes a painting of it. Elise was an accumulation of tiny heavens. Layla heard his breath hitch. "Your fiancé?" she said softly. You said she was the reason you couldn't sleep in that bed. He closed his eyes for a second, the light catching at the corners. She used to leave little drawings on the bedside table. Napkin sketches, a rough line of a city street, a hand with another hand drawn next to it.
I kept them.
I told myself keeping those drawings meant it wasn't all gone. I told myself once, when grief was fresh and sharp, that if I kept things exactly the way they were, maybe time would be dishonest and hand her back. It never did. Layla moved closer without deciding to, seating herself on the arm of the chair opposite him.
Tell me about her, she said.
Not a challenge, just a request from the part of her that wanted to stitch the jagged edges he showed her into something that made sense. He looked at her then, and for the first time since she'd met him, his gaze did not skate across the surface. It met her.
Elise was loud in the quietest ways, he said.
She would leave a radio on low while she cooked and sing like the world was listening. She gave things names, silly ones, a lamp named Gerald, a pothole named Louise. She wanted everything to have personality. She believed a house should feel like a person. She could take the smallest object and sprinkle story on it, so it became inevitable that we would love it. Layla listened, imagining the scene, him and Elise, small rituals and daily nonsense, the quiet domesticity that happens in the background of ordinary lives. It felt foreign and tender, and she understood how deeply the absence of that could hollow someone. What happened? She asked, barely audible. He folded his hands tighter, looked down at the coffee forming a web of steam. There was a fog that day. Early winter. She was on a flight to Milan to look at a restoration project for a chapel she wanted to help preserve. God, it sounds pretentious when I say it out loud. We argued on the doorstep over how she could waste time on things that didn't produce charts. She said I cared about numbers more than sunsets. I told her she romanticized poverty. She laughed and kissed me like she always did, and I watched the elevator doors close. An hour later, her plane went down. Silence poured into the apartment like cold water. Layla felt the room tilt, then steady.
I'm so sorry, she said finally. And it felt small and inadequate, and yet the only thing she could offer. It's not about sorry, Julian said, the words brittle.
It's about the things left unspoken. The last thing I told her was a complaint. I wish, every day, that I could take back the way my voice sounded that morning.
I wish I'd said, go see the world.
Bring me a postcard, or don't ever stop being that crazy woman who names Lamp Gerald. Instead, I said something small and cruel in my own way. Layla had expected anger toward the universe, toward fate. Instead, there was a grief like weather, slow, regular, and as inevitable as the tides. How did you
move on?
She asked. He let out a sound that might have been an embarrassed laugh.
I didn't. I built things around her absence.
Work became a scaffold to hold me up.
Boards, projections, mergers. All of it allowed me not to open boxes and see her handwriting.
For years I moved through my days like a man who was afraid that any small crack might let the whole building collapse. Layla felt a protectiveness well up inside her. She reached out and took his hand, a small contact, clumsy, unassuming.
You loved her, she said.
You still love her.
That doesn't mean you can't love again. He stared at their joined hands like it was an experiment.
People tell me that, but love isn't a light you can switch on. For a long time, the idea of loving felt reckless. I had a list of rules. Do not let anyone make you brittle. Do not let anyone have the map to the rooms you came from.
You were the first person to sit on that bed with no plan, no calculation, and your presence made the room
breathe. His admission hung in the air, vulnerable and exposed. Layla swallowed.
I didn't plan to do any of it, she confessed.
I was drunk, humiliated, stupid. I wanted to feel something that meant I was still alive. He looked up, and something like relief flickered through him. You woke me up, he said simply.
And that is
messy and inconvenient, and perhaps profoundly necessary. They sat together in the soft light, speaking of small things then. a memory of a bakery in Brooklyn she loved, a song he grew up with. The stories were ordinary, but the intimacy they created felt important and dangerous. Layla realized she admired the man who could orchestrate billion-dollar deals and was equally capable of folding a map carefully after he'd traced a future route on it with a finger. She left that day with a new sense of where she stood, not only as the girl who'd crawled into his bed for a dare, but as someone who had touched something raw and essential within him. At the same time, in the edges of her mourning, a faint unease flickered. There had been a man in the lobby with a folded newspaper and a headline that referenced offshore accounts. She hadn't thought much of it then, but the memory of it sat like a pebble in her shoe, small and irritating, likely to be ignored until it began to hurt. Outside, the city hustled on, oblivious to their quiet confessions. But under the hum of subways and the clatter of street vendors, the first whispers of a coming storm were forming, and nothing could remain private for long. The photo appeared before sunrise. Layla woke to a vibration on her phone. One, then another, then a cascade that refused to stop. The light from the screen painted her ceiling in flickers of white. She blinked, still half asleep, before opening the first message. It was from Naomi. "Layla, don't look online." They got a picture, but she looked anyway. Her thumb pressed the link, and the world seemed to freeze around her. There it was, a photograph taken in the grey dawn outside the Lexington Grand. She was stepping into a cab, hair loose, coat barely wrapped around her shoulders. The caption burned like acid. "The billionaire's new toy." Below it, a flood of comments, hundreds within minutes. Classic gold digger move. "So that's the dare girl? Guess it paid off." "He changes them every season." She dropped the phone. The sound echoed in the quiet apartment like a gunshot. For a long time, she sat there on the bed, heartbeat pounding against her ribs. The words felt unreal, like they were happening to someone else. But then the phone buzzed again, and the illusion broke. Her classmates, her co-workers at the cafe,
Even her aunt had texted, "Sweetheart, is this true?"
by the time she reached the window, the city was already awake, delivery trucks rumbling, horns blaring, the morning news looping headlines that had nothing to do with her. Yet she knew somewhere in that endless digital noise, her name was being passed from stranger to stranger like gossip at a party she hadn't chosen to attend. At Wolf Tower, Julian was already at his desk when his assistant knocked. He looked up, impassive, as the tablet was placed before him. The same headline glowing across the screen. He didn't flinch, didn't curse. He simply stared at it for a moment, jaw set. When Layla arrived an hour later, breathless from dodging photographers at the entrance, he was standing by the window, the skyline behind him like a wall of glass and silence. "They found me," she said, her voice trembling.
"How? I was careful." Julian turned, his expression unreadable.
"They always find what they want to see." He took a step closer, studied her face, the panic, the disbelief. "Are you hurt?" "Does it matter?" she whispered.
"They think I'm your—" The word toy stuck in her throat like something poisonous.
"They think I broke into your life for attention." Julian's gaze softened for a heartbeat, then cooled again.
"Let them think," he said. "They'll dig. They always do." His tone was calm, too calm.
That frightened her more than anger ever could. By noon, the story had spread beyond the gossip sites. The Dare Girl, they called her now. The mysterious woman who snuck into a billionaire's bed and stayed. Memes, hashtags, theories. A late-night talk show played the headline for laughs. A host winked at the camera and said, "Well, that's one way to get noticed." Layla stared at her reflection in the cafe window later that day. It was the same face, pale, tired, ordinary, but the world had repainted it into something scandalous. People at nearby tables whispered. 2 teenagers giggled, pretending to scroll through their phones. That evening, she hid in the corner of Julian's penthouse, scrolling through comments until her eyes blurred. Every line felt like a cut. She planned it. She seduced him. No one ends up in a billionaire's bed by accident. She closed the screen, her breath shaking. "Why aren't you saying anything?" she asked when he entered the room. "You could tell them the truth. Tell them it was nothing like they think." Julian loosened his tie, sat opposite her. "And what would that change? They'll only twist it again. The more I talk, the more they feed. So we just let them destroy me?" Her voice cracked. "Do you even realize what they're saying?" He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes steady. "I do. And I also know this. Storms burn themselves out faster when you don't fight the wind." Layla shook her head, disbelieving.
You think silence is strength?
"But silence is permission." For a moment, something flickered in his expression, guilt, maybe, or exhaustion.
You think I don't want to protect you?
"You think I haven't been through this before?" "The press doesn't care about truth, Layla. They care about blood." She felt tears gathering. "Then what happens to me?" He looked away. "You survive." Days passed, but time no longer felt linear. The phone calls slowed. The whispers did not. Her professors avoided her in the hallway. The gallery internship she'd dreamed of withdrew its offer. For reputational reasons. Her life had become a series of locked doors. Julian kept his distance, working late, fielding calls from advisors who spoke in crisis tones. She barely saw him except in brief glimpses. The shadow of his coat as he left, the smell of his cologne lingering like a ghost. One night she found him on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. The air was heavy with unspoken things. "They're saying I wanted fame," she said quietly. He didn't turn around. "Do you care what they say?"
Yes, she breathed.
"Because I finally started to believe I was more than what people said I was. And now it feels like I'm right back where I started. Invisible, but for all the wrong reasons." He closed his eyes. "This will pass." "No," she said. "This will change me." And then softly, the thing she didn't want to say. "Maybe that's what scares me most, that you'll let it." He didn't answer. The silence between them was thicker than any argument. That night, Layla lay awake on the same bed where everything had begun. The sheet smelled faintly of his cologne and coffee and rain. Somewhere, her name was still trending. Somewhere, strangers were still dissecting a photograph that had taken less than a second to exist. She turned off her phone, pulled the covers to her chin and whispered into the dark, "I was never supposed to be a dare." Her voice cracked. But now that's all they see. And somewhere in the next room, Julian sat alone, watching the headlines roll across the screen, his reflection caught between her face and his own. The silence he'd chosen was supposed to protect her. Instead, it had built a wall neither of them knew how to climb. By the end of the week, the storm had a name, the Dare Affair. It wasn't just an article anymore, it was everywhere. Talk shows,
News tickers,
podcasts debating ethics of billionaire romances. Layla's name had become an algorithm. Every search result, every headline, every thread. Her face stared back at her, framed between words like scandal, seduction, and deception. By Monday morning, the university sent an official email. In light of recent media exposure, the board has decided to temporarily suspend Miss Layla Quinn from academic participation pending review. The words felt clinical, detached, as if her existence could be paused with one administrative click. She read it 3 times before her fingers went numb. When she called Naomi, her best friend of 6 years, the line rang once before going to voicemail. She texted her aunt. The reply came hours later. "Layla, maybe it's best if you stay away for a while."
People are talking. That was the moment she understood. Scandal wasn't noise.
It was silence. Silence from everyone who used to care. At Wolf Enterprises, the boardroom was a different kind of battlefield. Julian stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, as 12 men and women in suits whispered behind laptops and folded arms. "Your personal matters are affecting investor confidence," said Caldwell, the chairman, his tone measured but sharp. "You understand the optics, Julian? This company cannot survive another headline." Julian's jaw flexed. "The company is fine."
"I'll handle the press." "You can't handle this," Caldwell shot back.
"You've been in every tabloid for a week. They're calling you the wolf who lost control. Our partners are asking questions." He straightened, voice low. "If they have questions, tell them the truth. I'm human." "That's not what shareholders pay for," Caldwell replied coldly. "Step down temporarily."
"Let PR clean this up." Julian didn't answer.
He just stared out the window where rain streaked across the skyline like scratches on glass. By the end of the meeting, he'd signed the papers. A voluntary leave, they called it. When the door closed behind him, the silence in the hallway felt heavier than applause. Layla spent her days indoors now. She stopped checking her phone, stopped walking to the corner cafe. Every time she stepped outside, someone seemed to know. The concierge at her building avoided eye contact. Delivery drivers hesitated before saying her name. She'd become a story people whispered about but never spoke to. One afternoon, a reporter managed to sneak past the front desk, shouting, "Layla, did you plan the scandal? Were you paid?" The words followed her down the hall like arrows until the elevator doors finally shut. When she reached the penthouse, Julian was there. No suit, no tie, just him. He looked tired in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. "I told them I'm fine," he muttered.
"They didn't believe me." "Who?"
she asked. "The board? The vultures." He gave a bitter laugh. "They asked me to step down, temporarily." She froze. "Julian, Don't," he said softly, cutting her off. "You didn't do this?" But the truth hovered between them like smoke. She hadn't started it, but she was the spark that lit it. That night, thunder rolled across the city. Layla stood on the balcony, barefoot, rain soaking through her silk pajama top. The skyline stretched before her, glowing, untouchable, indifferent. Down below, cars moved like veins of light. Somewhere, a siren wailed, swallowed by the distance. Julian stepped out behind her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The rain speckled his hair, darkened his shirt. "Come inside," he said quietly. She didn't move.
"I can't. It feels like the walls are closing in." He joined her at the railing.
For a long time, neither spoke. Then, barely above the rain, she whispered, "You're losing everything because of me." He turned to her, eyes catching the faint glint of lightning.
"Layla, no!" Her voice cracked.
"Your company, your reputation, your peace, all because of this. Because of me." For a moment, he just looked at her. And then, with that quiet certainty that always disarmed her, he said, "You're the only thing that makes sense." She blinked, tears blurring the lights. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "Because love isn't supposed to ruin people." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides pain. "Maybe it's not love that ruins us."
"Maybe it's everything we're willing to lose for it." The wind whipped through their hair.
The city below looked endless, glittering and merciless. Inside, the TV still played muted headlines. "Wolf resigns amid controversy." A panel of commentators debated his motives. One said, "Classic distraction move." Another laughed. "He's probably hiding in Switzerland by now." Layla turned away from the screen.
They'll never let us live this down." Julian poured another drink, set it aside untouched.
"They'll forget eventually." "But we won't," she whispered. He met her gaze, and for once, he didn't try to reassure her. He didn't lie, because they both knew love didn't protect them from the world. It only made the world hit harder. Later that night, she lay awake listening to the rain. Julian's silhouette lingered in the doorway, half shadow, half light. He watched her as if afraid she might disappear between one heartbeat and the next. In the stillness, the distance between them had never felt wider. He whispered, almost to himself, "I built everything to feel untouchable. And somehow, you're the only thing that ever touched me." Layla closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks.
Neither of them said the word love, but it pulsed in the silence. Fragile, unspoken, breaking under the weight of the world outside.
By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the city still looked bruised. A grey light filtered through the glass, pale and heavy. Julian lay asleep on the couch, his shirt still damp, one hand resting against an unfinished glass of whiskey. The storm had passed outside, but not within. Layla stood by the window, barefoot, wrapped in one of his shirts. The world below moved on, taxis cutting through puddles, streetlights fading one by one. She looked at him, at the man who had once been untouchable, now fractured because of her. Her throat tightened. She wanted to wake him, to say thank you or forgive me or don't let me go. But every word she thought of would only make it harder to leave. She sat at his desk, where financial reports still lay open. On a scrap of paper she wrote 2 words, trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry." She stared at it for a long time, then placed it on his pillow, right where her head had rested the first night she met him. Her suitcase was light. She hadn't packed much, just clothes, sketchbook, and the one photo she had of her parents. When the elevator doors closed, her reflection shimmered in the glass, a girl fading into the city she once dreamed of conquering. By the time Julian woke, sunlight had begun to fill the room. The balcony door stood open, curtains fluttering with the morning breeze. For a second it felt like peace, until he noticed the silence. Her coffee mug sat cold on the table.
Her scarf was gone. "Layla?"
He called out. No answer. He walked through the penthouse, the living room, the kitchen, the hallway, calling her name again and again. Nothing but echoes. Then his eyes caught the note. 2 words. "So small, so final, I'm so sorry." He sat on the edge of the bed, reading it again and again, as if the letters would rearrange themselves into something else. A promise, a reason, a direction. But they never did. Only the scent of her perfume lingered, faint and cruel. That day, he didn't go to the office. He didn't answer calls. He just drove through Lexington Avenue, past the cafes where she once waited for him, through the park where she once told him she used to feed the birds after class, through every corner of Manhattan that had somehow learned her name. Each place felt emptier than the last. At one point, he stopped at a red light, and on the massive LED billboard above, her face appeared, a tabloid still image, her caught mid-step, leaving his building. The headline read, "The Dare Girl Vanishes. Wolf's silence grows louder." He wanted to tear it down. He wanted to scream. But he just sat there, staring, as the light turned green and horns blared behind him. By evening, he ended up at the waterfront, the same spot he used to visit when he couldn't sleep after his fiancée died. Back then, grief was a wound. Now it was a hollow. He threw his phone into the Hudson River and watched the ripples fade. He could almost hear her voice. "Because for once, I didn't want to feel invisible." He laughed under his breath, bitter, broken. "Guess I made you invisible again," he murmured. The night swallowed his words whole. Layla, meanwhile, sat on a nearly empty bus headed north. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, a stranger wearing her sadness. Every few miles she imagined him waking up, finding the note. Would he hate her? Would he understand? When the bus crossed the bridge out of Manhattan, she whispered, "Goodbye, Julian." The words fogged the glass, then disappeared, just like her, back in the city. The headlines evolved with cruel precision. "Wolf steps down officially." Investors demand restructuring. The Dare girl's disappearance, runaway or cover-up? He tried to ignore them. He hired a private investigator. He called every contact he could, but there was no trace, no bank withdrawals,
No phone records. As if she had dissolved into the air, days became weeks.
His penthouse grew quiet, too quiet. The plants withered. The bed stayed untouched. The smell of her shampoo faded from the sheets. He found himself standing in front of the elevator one morning, pressing the lobby button, half expecting her to be waiting downstairs like before, holding her sketchbook, pretending not to be nervous. But the doors opened to nothing. One night a storm rolled in again, like the city remembering. Julian sat alone in the dark, the skyline flickering outside. He picked up the note again, the same 2 words, crumpled and soft from his hands.
"I'm so sorry," he whispered back. "So am I." And for the first time in years,
He let himself cry, and not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd never said. Because love, he realized, didn't end when someone left. It lingered, in half-drunk coffee cups, in elevator reflections, in notes that said everything and nothing somewhere miles away. Layla looked up at the same storm through the window of a small inn in Maine. She didn't know he was searching for her. She didn't know that the man she thought she had ruined was breaking quietly in her absence. She only knew that every time thunder rolled across the sky, her heart ached in time with it, like the world itself was whispering his name. Maine was quiet that winter, the kind of quiet that felt like mercy. Snow blanketed the coastline, softening every sharp edge. The sea lay grey and calm beyond the dunes, waves rolling slow, like an old song on repeat. Layla lived in a small house near the cliffs, one of those weather-beaten cottages that always smelled faintly of salt and cedar. It had taken her months to find this place, months to disappear. Each morning, she lit the fireplace, made tea, and sketched. The drawings were simple: shells, the horizon, her hands, nothing grand.
nothing of the past.
Sometimes she still woke from dreams of New York, of lights and noise, and a voice that said her name in the dark. But she'd tell herself, that's gone now, and for a while she almost believed it. That afternoon, the sky had begun to turn a soft lilac, the kind that promised snow. Layla was outside stacking logs by the porch when she heard it, the low hum of an engine, unfamiliar in this lonely stretch of coast. A black car rolled down the dirt road, its tires crunching over frozen gravel. It stopped a few feet from her front steps. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He looked like a ghost of the man she remembered, thinner, paler, no tie, no armor of the corporate world. But those eyes, those same storm-grey eyes, her breath caught.
"Julian?"
For a moment neither of them moved. The wind carried a faint scent of ocean salt and wood smoke between them. He took a step closer, his shoes sinking slightly into the snow.
"How did you find me?"
She whispered, voice trembling between fear and disbelief. He smiled faintly, tired but real. "You left your birthday marked on my calendar." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a worn leather planner. The page was creased, her name written in neat blue ink beside the date, circled twice. "I checked every coast town in Maine until I found the one with an art teacher named Layla Quinn." His tone was quiet, almost teasing, but his eyes gave him away. They were red from sleepless nights. Layla's throat tightened. She wanted to say so many things. Why are you here? Why now? You shouldn't have come. But all that came out was a whisper. "You shouldn't have looked for me." He stepped closer. Snowflakes landed on his coat, melted against the warmth of his skin.
"Maybe not," he said softly.
"But I had to," he exhaled, the words trembling with cold and something deeper. "You were never supposed to be a dare, Layla." His gaze locked with hers, unflinching. raw.
You became my truth. For a second, the world seemed to stop. The wind, the ocean, even the ache between them. Layla felt something inside her break open, like ice cracking after a long freeze.
All those nights of silence, the letters she never sent, the tears she refused to cry, they spilled out at once. She dropped the log she was holding. It hit the snow with a dull thud. Her hands flew to her mouth, and a sound escaped her, half sob, half laughter. Then she moved. 2 steps, 3, and she was in his arms, clinging to him as if the world depended on it. Julian held her just as tightly, one hand tangled in her hair, the other pressed against her back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing left to explain. The snow fell harder now, surrounding them like a curtain, the sea roaring faintly in the distance. Layla buried her face against his chest, feeling the roughness of his coat, the steady beat of his heart. It was the same rhythm that once lulled her to sleep in the city that had tried to break them. "I thought you hated me," she murmured. Julian shook his head slowly.
I hated the silence. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. I never stopped looking.
"I never stopped loving you." She closed her eyes, tears hot against the cold.
I didn't think you'd come. He smiled, in that quiet, almost broken smile. I didn't think you'd let me go. For a long moment they stood there, 2 figures surrounded by falling snow, the sky turning from lilac to deep indigo.
The only sound was the soft rhythm of breath, the faint creak of winter branches. Inside the cottage, Layla lit the fireplace again. Julian sat near it, hands extended toward the flames. His coat steamed as it dried, and for the first time in months, warmth returned to the room. A warmth that had nothing to do with fire. He looked around at the small space, the sketches pinned to the wall, the teacups lined neatly on the shelf, the stack of firewood by the door. "You built a whole world here," he said quietly. Layla poured him a cup of tea, her hands still trembling slightly. "I tried," she admitted, "but it didn't feel like living. It felt like waiting." Julian looked up at her, eyes soft.
Then maybe it's time to stop waiting. She nodded, tears threatening again. But this time, they weren't from pain. Outside, the wind howled softly, like the sea breathing against the shore.
Inside, time seemed to pause, 2 souls rediscovering each other in the quiet glow of forgiveness. No promises, no explanations, just truth. New York shimmered beneath the soft blush of spring. The city hadn't changed much, still fast, loud, hungry, but for Layla it felt quieter this time, perhaps because she no longer needed it to notice her. 6 months had passed since the snow in Maine melted into sea foam and they'd driven south together. No entourage, no headlines, no ghosts, just the hum of the road and the sound of his hand finding hers whenever she drifted to sleep. Now, standing in front of the Lexington Grand once again, Layla couldn't help but smile. The same marble facade, the same revolving doors, the same city that had once watched her break. Julian stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the building as if it were a piece of his past, finally ready to let him go. He turned to her, eyes softer than she remembered.
Are you ready?
Layla took a breath. "I think I've been ready for a long time." The elevator ride felt surreal. The quiet hum, the golden reflection of their faces in the mirrored walls. It was the same elevator she had taken that drunken night when everything began, but now she was sober, alive and utterly herself. When the doors slid open, the penthouse was exactly as it had been. Elegant, sterile and far too large for one soul. Yet something was different. The air didn't feel cold anymore. The curtains billowed gently in the afternoon breeze. On the nightstand, A single envelope rested. Julian had placed it there before she arrived. Layla picked it up, fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. Inside was a simple note on cream paper. "I never believed in accidents until you." Her throat tightened as she looked at him. "You kept this?" He smiled faintly. "No, I wrote it this morning," she exhaled, a soft laugh breaking through her tears. "You really are impossible." Julian stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "No, Layla, I just stopped pretending this wasn't real." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched endlessly below, sunlight scattering like diamonds across the Hudson. Layla crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, that same bed that had once been the stage for a foolish dare. She brushed her hand over the linen, then turned to him. "This is where it started," she said quietly. Julian's gaze softened, and he came to sit beside her. "No," he murmured, "this is where I began." The words sank into the silence between them, not grand, not rehearsed, just true. Layla leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked, half teasing, half wistful. "Every day," he said simply. "Not because of what happened, but because it reminded me that life doesn't wait for those too afraid to feel." She smiled through tears. "So this is what redemption feels like." He turned to her then, cupping her face with one hand. "No, this is what love feels like, when it doesn't need to be perfect to be real." Their lips met, slow, unhurried, familiar, not like the first time when everything was confusion and fear. This was a homecoming. The city's light flickered through the window, wrapping around them like a halo. Outside, traffic hummed, life continued. But in that room, in that precise, fragile moment, time was kind. When they finally pulled apart, Layla laughed softly.
"Do you realize this all started because of a stupid dare?"
Julian smiled, thumb tracing her jawline. "The best mistake I ever made." They lay back on the bed side by side, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, she didn't feel like a trespasser in his world. "Do you think the world will believe us now?" she asked. Julian shook his head, eyes half closed. "They don't need to." He reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "We do." Hours later, the city had gone quiet. The skyline shimmered in the distance, lights winking like constellations. Layla turned on her side, watching Julian's profile in the dim glow. His features were softer now, the sharp edges dulled by peace. She whispered, "Thank you for finding me." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with a tenderness that melted every last wall between them.
"I didn't find you, Layla," he said.
"You were never lost. You were just waiting for the right story." She smiled, the kind that came from deep inside, the kind that meant healing. The night stretched on, calm and infinite. Somewhere below, a car horn echoed faintly, a reminder that the world was still spinning. But here, in this quiet space where their story had begun, two people who once collided by accident finally chose to stay. Not by dare, not by destiny, by choice. And this time, when Layla closed her eyes, she wasn't running from the world. She was resting in it with him.